So you don't think this will stop at Ukraine?
No, absolutely not. He's not going to stop until he plugs all 9 of the gateways. And even if he secures Ukraine totally, he still needs to move further. Moldova, Romania, Poland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. He'll need parts or all of them.
Does that seem like an achievable goal, given the performance we've seen of his military and the fact that sanctions are now tightening around him?
Well, let's start with the military. Nobody expected Ukraine to fall within a month. They did what they call some thunder runs, thinking they might get lucky on Kiev. That failed. They're now fighting this Russian style with heavy artillery until the city is leveled. They're going to do that over and over again. It's going to take them over a month. Probably no more than 6, though. Then there'll be an insurgency. The Russians know how to deal with that as well. So from the Russian point of view, sure, this hasn't been all sunshine and chocolate, but it's kind of par for the course for how they fight wars. The sanctions did surprise him. The sanctions surprised me. I think the sanctions have surprised everyone. I don't think anyone thought the Europeans were going to get this stiff-backed so quickly. And he was certainly thinking that he was going to have more time and more flexibility. And I don't mean to suggest he's done. If you look at the pipeline infrastructure going from Russia to Europe, there are a couple of undersea pipelines that no one can disrupt, that you don't have to get insurance from. You don't have to worry about a shipper or a Ukrainian sapper. They're going to be the last ones to go. And the only way they'll go is if the Turks and the Germans directly sanction those projects. That's the only weak point they have. So we're going to be moving into an era here within a month where the Russians can directly and accurately go to Berlin and go to Ankara and say, look, we can leave the lights on for you, but everyone else is screwed. There's a price, of course, and that's making sure that NATO can't function. So until World War II, geography was what determined economic success. You had to have access to certain points. You had to fortify your borders in certain ways, like behind mountains. In the case of Russia specifically, they've got 9 gateways to their territories, and they've been invaded through them 50 times. So what Putin's trying to do right now is plug the gateways. 2 of them, unfortunately, are on the other side of Ukraine. Now, when World War II ended, the United States told everyone that geography no longer exists. We're going to protect everyone. We're going to allow for trade among everyone. And that is what gave us free trade in the world that we know. But we did that to buy up an alliance to fight the Cold War. Cold War ended 30 years ago. We've been edging away ever since. And in the last 8 presidential elections, we voted for the guy who wanted to move away from free trade and globalization. The exception, of course, is this last one where there was not a pro-free trader running. So that's kind of piece 1. Piece 2 is demography. Everything that you do is determined by your age. When you're 20 years in your 30s, you're having kids. When you're 50s, you're saving for retirement. Well, the whole world has aged as we urbanized and industrialized under globalization. Well, 70 years on, we now have a number of countries, Russia included, that has more people in their 60s than their 50s, than their 40s, than their 30s, than their teens. So the return to geography explains the why of what Russia's doing, and its collapsing demography explains the why now. If they don't do it now, they'll never be able to.
Yeah, but closing off their borders, I mean, where was the threat of invasion? It was invading.
Today there isn't one. But like I said, they've been invaded 50 times. And they know if they don't plug those gaps now, they will lack the military to do it in the future. They're just preparing for the next major conflagration because they know next time they won't be able to fight a general war.
So you reject the idea that this is some sort of delusional idea of Putin's that, for lost grandeur, you think he's making a calculated decision that they're vulnerable?
A calculated decision, and all the rhetoric that he has used in the last week, he has used before. It's just been a while. He had some rather colorful things to say about the Chechens when he first became president back in the early 2000s. Actually, in my second book, The Absent Superpower, there's a whole chapter called The Twilight War on Russia doing exactly this, as well as the next 5 countries that he's going to invade, which I think we can look forward to later this year. We're going to lose 5 million barrels per day of Urals crude within the next few weeks, and somewhere between 5 and 10 BCF of natural gas going to Europe. We're going to have a food crisis by the fourth quarter because the world's largest wheat exporter just invaded the fifth largest one. There isn't going to be any planting season in Ukraine this year. We have a phosphate fertilizer shortage because of what's going on in China. Because of natural gas prices, we now have a global nitrogen fertilizer shortage. And Russia and Belarus combined are the world's largest potash producers. So a lot of farmers the world over are not going to use fertilizer this year. So we'll have a collapse in yields. That is how a famine begins. Global wheat stores are less than 5 weeks of usage. Conservatively, between what's going on in Russia and Ukraine and what's going on in the fertilizer markets, the price of wheat between now and the end of the year is going to quadruple. The reference that Jacob made about what happened in the Middle East was when in one region it tripled. We're talking a global quadrupling. In the places that are more exposed to these producers, it'll be significantly worse. So yes, some degree of political unrest that is significantly worse than anything that we've seen with the Arab Spring is baked in now for the entirety of the Middle East. I'd also be a little bit worried about India and Pakistan. I'm horrified about what's going to happen in China. Because China is facing a complete food cycle collapse because of the combination of African swine flu and now what's happening to the Russians. 3 years ago, the Chinese were infected with African swine fever, and they ended up culling more of their hogs than the world's commercial farms have. They're now trying to rebuild it, but almost all the people who came in to rebuild have no experience in farming, and they have never gotten rid of African swine fever. So when you want to build up a herd of hogs that are in the tens of the millions, there isn't enough fodder. So what the Chinese have been doing is buying food from everywhere, even things that are wildly inappropriate. Not just corn from Iowa, but broken rice from India, and even food-grade wheat, like croissant-grade wheat from France. Anything they can find. That's what's drawn everything down. And it's all going to be wasted because they never got rid of the disease in the first place. So the Chinese have decided that all that is left, the only thing they can guarantee is rice. So they've pulled all the phosphate off the market, phosphate that the rest of the world needs for other fertilizer. So we're going onto a mono-food system in the world's single largest population with an economy that is dependent upon globalization, and globalization is going away. There's no way this ends well for the Chinese.
Is there no way they can cushion this? And is this a political risk?
It's absolutely a risk, and I'm not sure that they do have the tools anymore. They might have them on paper. They might actually have the policy in place. They may even have the infrastructure. But one of the things we learned about Xi in the last year is he's become so paranoid and insular, and he's literally shot the messenger so many times that no one wants to bring him bad news. So I think the best example of that manifesting as policy is the power outages that started last May. Best guess, he didn't find out about them until September. We didn't get our first real policy to deal with them until 2 weeks ago. And if you've got a one-man shop, a cult of personality, and the bureaucrats are afraid to bring clashing policy priorities back to the boss, the whole thing breaks down. We're certainly seeing that with their COVID policy, and of course it doesn't help that their vaccine doesn't really work. Right now, what's going on in the Black Sea and in the Baltic Sea with Russian crude is we're not dealing with the sanctions situation. What we're dealing with is whenever a country shoots at civilian shipping, as Russia has done, every maritime indemnity insurance for every vessel is null and void. So the vessels have to vacate. So we have seen probably 3.5 million barrels of Urals crude a day for the last 3 days just not get picked up.
Yeah.
It's not a boycott. It's not sanctions. It's its insurance companies and shippers and ship captains just refusing to go there at all. And as long as this is a hot war, this is where it's going to be. So you should take any crude that was coming out of Primorsk near Petersburg or Novorossiysk on the Black Sea and just write it off. The same thing is happening for the Tengiz Chevroil project on the Caspian and Kazakhstan, not because the Kazakhs have joined sides here, but all that crude goes to Novorossiysk as well. No one's picking it up, so it's all backing up with the pipelines. The Russians only have 80 million barrels of storage. So at current rates, you're talking less than 2 months before they have to start shutting in production.
Yeah.
The last time they shut in production, it took them 30 years to bring it back online. So we're not talking here about Urals going away for a week or a month. We're talking years, taking the single largest crude grade in the world and just removing it. 5% drop. We haven't seen that in relative terms since World War II.
Yeah.
And if you are in Europe and you were the primary user of Urals, you now have to get crude somewhere else. The next best bet for them is West Africa, because they're all former colonies and there's a security and political and economic relationship. They can do that. They can pull that off. But that means none of it's going to China. So China is kind of the last man in the kick line here for all the resources disruptions that are happening, all the energy disruptions, all the food disruptions. They gave Russia, from Russia's point of view, a blank check, and now they're having to cash it, and it is not going to end well. Two groups of oligarchs. You've got the ones that stole from Russia in the 1990s. Putin tamed all of those in the first half of the 2000s. And some of them are now the ones that are saying things against the war from outside of Russia. Going after their assets is all well and good. They started as crooks. Some of them kind of reformed themselves. That's a personal or political preference. I don't think there'd be any blowback from going after those guys. The second group are called the Silivarks. They're people who came up with Putin from the security apparatus who then have seized other things. They are absolutely economically incompetent. And I heartily encourage everybody goes after those people's things. If you have assets in Russia and you haven't written it down to zero, I'm kind of wondering what you're waiting for. Because no one's getting any of that out. As for US or EU property in Europe, that's going to be so minor, it's not going to move the needle in terms of decision-making in any capital.
Will Russia's population see an accelerated decline due to war deaths and food famine? How hard will they be hit? And again, does that give us any insight into Putin's ability to survive this? Does he survive this?
Oh, that's a great question. Whether Putin will survive, I don't know. People in this part of the world tend to slip in the shower and fall in some bullets from time to time. It's entirely possible that'll happen to him. I have no inside information on that side. He's done a really good job kind of consolidating his control of the system. So I don't think that's a high risk for him. Russia is a very large food exporter. The big problem is that they do a lot of wheat, they do some potatoes, the stuff you can do with cold climates, and they import everything else. So the import-export is over. So they're back to kind of a monochromatic, high saturated fat diet. This is one of the reasons why Russia and China are duking it out for the world's worst demography. We know based on the demographics, they will not survive this century. The question is, how fast do they fade from the world? I don't expect Russia to have meaningful food shortages in terms of starvation. There will always be a distribution issue. And with every company that deals with the logistics or tech that pulls out of Russia, the distribution becomes a little bit more old school. So growing the food, I'm not concerned about. Distributing it in a way that keeps everybody alive, that's a different question. In terms of war deaths, even if this turns out to a really brutal, grinding World War II style house-to-house obliteration, you're probably looking at fewer than 1 million Russians dying. That's a lot. It's all concentrated in the young age group, but it's all dudes. And as Russia has shown, you can lose 15% of your male population of an age bracket and still limp on. I think the bigger problem overall is the outmigration. In the 1990s, based on whose numbers you're looking, the Russians lost between 2 and 10 million people to outwork migration. We're now having a second wave. Everyone who grew up under Putin, who is now in their 20s, are seeing everything that they thought that Putin gave them in terms of stability and economic growth dissolve in literally days. And anyone who can get out is getting out, and they're taking their skills with them. And the Russian educational system really collapsed in mass back in the 80s and was never reformed. So these people are irreplaceable.
How does Russia's invasion of Poland and the Baltics play out compared to its invasion of Ukraine? You said earlier, this is just the beginning. Would we expect, does it look the same? Is it, same amount of civilian casualties? And how does that complicate things, right? With now that you're talking about, say, Poland?
Sure. So assuming for the moment that the Russian gambit to split off Turkey and Germany works, because if it doesn't, then NATO's a very different place. But let's assume that that works. In that specific scenario, the Americans would be unlikely to function because they need those bases in Turkey and Germany in order to forward project it to these countries. However, if we get to that point, I think that the violence would be significantly worse and the damage to civilian infrastructure wouldn't be incidental. It would be very deliberate. The Russians have been agitating against these countries since the Soviet Union fell. And while there are a lot of people in Russia who see Ukrainians as brothers and sisters and cousins, there is no one in Russia who's like, oh yeah, I just want to go and hug a Pole. So just the obliteration level of artillery use that we would see in places like Warsaw and Riga, we really have not seen that anywhere in the world except Grozny. Right now, the NATO policy, and I think this will stick as long as the Ukraine war is going on, is to shove as many weapons and as much intelligence and maybe volunteers into Ukraine as possible, so that the Russians have to fight for every bloody inch. And then when they're done, they have to go back and do it all over because there's a partisan insurrection. Because as long as Russia is bleeding in Ukraine, they don't have a free hand to do what's next. And I think there's a recognition now in NATO capitals that this is not just about the separatist regions in Crimea and Kiev, that this is about going for the whole enchilada while the Russians still can. And so anything you can do to keep the Russians in Ukraine is a win.